Our next speaker is a leader who represents a new generation of the African leadership, bold, visionary, and deeply committed to building institutions that work for people, enterprise, and future generations. She operates at the intersection of leadership, governance, economic transformation, as well as inclusive innovation. With over 2 decades of experience in spanning over business consulting, economic development, institutional strategy, her work has consistently focused on aligning people, systems, and purpose to drive sustainable impact. As a member of the Parliament, co-founder and deputy leader of the new generational political movement, the founder of the South African Women's Commission, she continues to champion women's leadership, entrepreneurship, as well as inclusive economic participation across South Africa and the continent. She's a woman who stands on true transformation, not only about representation, but it's also about building systems, creating opportunity, ownership, and dignity for all. Please rise as we join the one and only, our MP, Ms. Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster. Let us stand. Thanks so much. Welcome. I don't know if you want to stand or would you like a handheld?
Good morning, ladies and a few gentlemen. What a warm introduction, and what a well put together introduction. I know that my bio doesn't read like that, so I was listening to it. I was like, oh, somebody made this sound really nice. So thank you very much. Thank you for the warm introduction and the warm welcome, and good morning to everybody. It is so great to be here. I was saying to Zimkita that I really feel honored. I feel privileged to be in this room and in this conversation. And that is because I believe that this is the next phase or the next generation of actually what transformation, what inclusion, what democracy even in our South African context looks like. So I really am excited. I've heard, I was unfortunately not able to be here yesterday, but I've heard about some of the conversations that took place yesterday, some of the engagements, and it has me thinking, what a time to be alive. So I really first want to start off by really thanking the organizers for the invitation to be here today. I want to start off with a story. It is a story that I often reflect on when I think about women, when I think about women and ownership. So this one day I'm listening to a radio program. And the question is, when did you know it was time to leave your relationship? So a lady calls in and she tells the story. Her story says it was her birthday and it was her birthday. She had been getting a sense that, there's something being organized, and it's something big. I mean, I had a surprise 40th. It wasn't really a surprise. It was a surprise 40th. And I remember at some point I started giving instructions to my sister cousin. She's my cousin, but she's my sister. And I was like, hey, guys, make sure this happens. Make sure there isn't this. Because I was like I can see these people are up to something. So she said she could feel that, something's happening. But anyway, on the day, she gets whisked away. She eventually gets to this venue, to this place. She arrives. It's a house, a grand house, a beautiful house, a mansion. She gets into this house, and when she gets inside, all her friends are there. Her family is there. Surprise! Big thing. The surprise isn't just the party, the surprise is the house. Her husband has built this house unbeknownst to her. Okay. He has found land, appointed architects, contracted builders, built the whole house, got interior designers, had it designed, got it fully furnished, and this is the surprise. She says, the people who know her really well in the room looked awkward, But some people were like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. He bought your whole mansion. He got your whole mansion. She says for her, that is the day that confirmed that she had to leave the marriage.
Wow.
Because it spoke of a life where she was merely participating but didn't have a sense of ownership. And this is what I think about when I think about what we're talking about today. When we talk about the idea of participating, of being included, but not having the ownership, not having the control. We have been allowed into the house. I mean, heck, we've been invited into the house. Space has been made for us. They often call it a seat at the table. And I always ask, whose table is this?
Yeah.
Who set it? Who decided what's on the menu? It is just a seat at the table. So too often we're allowed into the house, but we didn't draw the blueprint. We didn't determine the architecture. We did not choose where resources flow and how they flow. We didn't design the rules of ownership. We didn't decide whose risk matters, and we did not build the valuation models. We're included in the house, but aren't empowered to architect it. And so that's why I think the issue before us today is so important, and it's no longer about inclusion, but it is about architecture. And so I come to this house today with 3 experiences. I come here as somebody who herself has been an entrepreneur and an enterprise and economic development practitioner. I come as someone who has led women's advocacy organizations, the Business Women's Association, the International Women's Forum, and others. And I come now as a legislator and a political leader. So I've experienced the system in different ways. Yeah. Across all these spaces, though, I have observed the same pattern repeating itself in different forms. So as an entrepreneur and as an enterprise and economic development practitioner, I worked with businesses that are trying to access markets, procurement opportunities, funding, and growth pathways. And I began to realize something. I began to realize that capital doesn't only flow where there's potential. Capital flows towards familiarity. It does not only flow toward potential. It flows toward familiarity. Systems fund what already resembles power. Systems fund what looks familiar. Systems fund what sounds familiar. And systems fund what already carries inherited legitimacy, an assumption of legitimacy. And so when you look at many women entrepreneurs, particularly women, particularly township entrepreneurs, particularly informal business owners, they find themselves navigating systems that were never calibrated around their economic realities. So you find there are collateral requirements, procurement thresholds, compliance burdens, formalization assumptions, and credit scoring models that are all designed around particular histories and particular pathways into the economy. And so often, women aren't excluded because they lack capability. They are excluded because the system was calibrated around different economic histories and different economic assumptions. And then that's in the enterprise development space and with entrepreneurs. Then in the women's advocacy spaces that I was in, I observed another layer of the problem. And that was participation without economic control. That was representation. So you're represented, you're there, but without the wealth accumulation. It was women who were over-networked because we're told that's what, it's about being in the room, it's about the network, but are under-owned and have a lack of ownership. Women who are invited onto panels, visible in campaigns, celebrated in branding, included in language, but structurally excluded from ownership at scale. And I think many of us have become fluent in this language of inclusion, but for too long, we've avoided the harder conversation of ownership. And this is the thing about ownership. Ownership shifts the trajectory altogether. Ownership changes power. Ownership shapes influence. Ownership determines whose interests systems actually protect. It determines who accumulates wealth over generations. Ownership determines who actually shapes the future. Who gets to shape the future? Not just the future economy, but the future itself. And that's on advocacy. And then lastly, as a legislator, as a political leader, I began engaging more deeply with systems themselves. Development funding institutions, procurement systems, banking regulations, capital allocation frameworks. And I came to understand something phenomenal. Markets are not natural phenomenon. They are designed systems, they are manufactured. But the good thing about that, it means that they can also be redesigned. If they were designed, it means they can be redesigned. And it means that they can be designed with the realities of those who design the system in mind. It means that you can now carry the realities of what is actually considered risk, what is considered value, what is considered professional, what is considered scalable. Because all of this is socially constructed. The ideas of what risk is and looks like, the idea of what value is and looks like, these are things that are socially constructed. And if we're honest, many of our financial systems still reflect the ownership assumptions of those who built the systems. That's for another era, it's for another demographic, it's for another lived experience. So when we ask why systems and why ownership patterns remain unequal, we have to interrogate the architecture itself. We have to start with the question of who designed the house, and then we'll understand why the outcomes of the system are what they are. So South Africa particularly, I speak of the South African context, has made quite good progress when it comes to financial inclusion. We've made good progress when it comes to participation, getting in the room, but ownership really remains deeply entrenched in a concentration of those who designed it. I want to make an example. If you look at the JSE, ownership and institutional investment power remains concentrated, largely in a relatively number of actors, small number of large actors and legacy capital networks. Legacy capital networks. If you look at procurement ownership patterns, the gap between commitment and reality is always very revealing. You have a commitment, and this in South Africa, the commitment is by the president, directing 40% of public procurement towards women-owned businesses, and we sit at a reality of less than 15%. And that tells you, that gap tells you something. It tells you that commitments themselves don't automatically transform the behavior of institutions, because systems reproduce themselves unless there's an intervention into the system. Systems will reproduce themselves. That is, unless incentives, unless accountability mechanisms and ownership pathways themselves are intentionally redesigned, unless there's an intentional intervention. Then if you look at venture capital, that pattern becomes even clearer, because globally, women-owned businesses receive less than 5% of venture capital funding. And in South Africa, where we make up half of the population, we still account for a much smaller proportion of business ownership and definitely of formal capital control. If we look now at women-controlled funds, the number remains limited relative to the scale of institutional capital that actually exists. If we look at DFI lending patterns, we still have to ask difficult questions about where development finance actually flows and who qualifies as investment ready, and whether ownership transformation is truly occurring at scale. And that brings us to the question of, if you're looking at the analogy about the house, who owns the deed? And that picture remains very, very clear, because women remain structurally underrepresented in ownership itself, and that matters because the economy doesn't reward participation. It's never rewarded participation. It rewards ownership. So there's a profound difference between earning in a system and owning it. There's a profound difference between access to money and ownership of appreciating assets. So you're talking about land ownership. You're talking about equity ownership. You're talking about shareholding. You're talking about investment power. You're talking about intellectual property. These are mechanisms through which historically wealth has compounded, and it doesn't only compound in one generation, it compounds throughout generations and across generations. And so women remain structurally excluded from these forms of ownership. And when that happens, then inequality reproduces itself, even when you have participation. Because what did I say? The system doesn't reward participation. There is a saying, it's by Audre Lorde, and he says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Right. So,
the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so that's why when I started, I said the good thing about this is that if a system is designed, it means we can redesign it. We must redesign the system. So women must take the power to redesign existing systems. It's been said that freedom is never given, it's won. And I want to say power is never given, it is won. And I don't want to say it's taken, because I've heard that a lot. You can't take it, you've got to win it. You've actually got to win it. You've got to build what needs to be built in order to win it. You've got to organize in order to win it. You've got to collaborate in order to win it. In the same way that freedom is given and not won, in the same way, that freedom is never given but won, power is never given but won. And so when I speak about power, I'm not talking about symbolism. When I speak about power, I'm talking about the power to allocate capital. And I say this because we often see women in places, women in positions, and get frustrated with those same women. But why aren't things changing? There's a woman at the head. Why aren't things changing? There's a woman in the room, but does she have power? Does she have control? So real power, not symbolism. The power to allocate capital, the power to shape institutions, the power to influence regulation, the power to determine investment priorities, the power to redesign what incentives look like, the power to actually own the productive assets, the power to shape the architecture itself. And that means that there are some institutions that are going to have to change.
Yes, they like it.
I'm going to start with banks. Means banks must change. Because banks often replicate the inherited systems of exclusion. And they do that under the language of risk management. I said earlier, who gets to define what risk is and what it looks like?
You.
Who gets to define collateral, what collateral is? Who gets to define that? Who gets to define how township and women-owned businesses are actually scored? Who gets to design how lending products are made and what they look like? Because if you have entire categories of entrepreneurs that are permanently coded as high risk, then exclusion becomes institutionalized through policy. So that has got to change. Banks have got to change. Then development finance institutions have got to change. Because if development finance can't meaningfully unlock ownership for communities and categories that have been excluded, we must then interrogate, is development actually happening? Can we call it development? And this means that the mandates have got to be ownership-centered. We've got to be able to measure ownership. Measure not only loans disbursed, but you must track. And those loans disbursed is the equity participation that's been achieved. In those loans disbursed is the industrial capacity that is built for women. In loans disbursed is the long-term wealth accumulation that is an outcome. Pension funds.
Okay.
Pension fund mandates must change. Because this is the thing, there are trillions that sit in pension funds and the mandates of pension funds. And we don't talk about this enough. Pension capital is ultimately what shapes the economic future of a nation. And so, pension fund mandates have got to change to intentionally direct long-term investment, long-term capital towards women-owned funds, towards inclusive industrialization. You've got to measure whatever industrialization you say you have in any country, does it include women? You have to make sure that they are directed towards investing in African innovation ecosystems, uniquely African innovation ecosystems, and long-term ownership creation. We must also talk about stock exchange access pathways. I said earlier that the pathways to stock exchange access are prohibitive. But here's something that's also telling. there is little to no publicly available information on the ownership of women in this stock exchange in our country, as an example. And you know what that tells you? It tells you that we're measuring less whether there's ownership, and we're measuring more, are there women who sit on the boards? Are there women who are executive directors on those? Are there women who are CEOs? And even those numbers are low, because you're looking at about 23, 24, 25% executive directorship on JSE-listed companies by women. But it is telling that we are not measuring ownership of women on those listed companies. What we're measuring is only participation. So we've got a lower barriers to entry in stock exchanges. We have to expand and build for ourselves alternative listing platforms. We've got to build stronger pathways for SMEs and capital markets, and we really, really have to create more institutional support for women who are moving within their enterprises from survival to scale, to the kind of scale that can be listed. And then, lastly and most importantly for me, institutional reform alone is not enough. What I've been talking about, that banks must change, development funding institutions must change, stock exchange access pathways must change. This is all institutional. But history has taught us that sometimes transformation doesn't begin by entering old systems. Sometimes it begins by building parallel systems. And this is something I am passionate about and believe strongly in. In our country, I believe how we attain that, how we achieve that, is through building, as an example, our rural economy, our township economy, parallel systems. And I want to say this. There's evidence when you look, for instance, at the informal economy. When you look at the informal economy, it is evidence not of a failure of some sort of that system itself. It's evidence that people do build parallel systems when the formal systems have failed to include them. And so, transformation doesn't always begin by entering old systems. Sometimes it begins only when you build parallel systems. And women in Africa have actually been building parallel systems for generations. We've built community finance. It has looked different in different countries on the continent. We call it Stokvel in many instances. We categorize it that way. Women-owned funds, women-led procurement ecosystems, African innovation ecosystems. Women have always built economic systems of resilience. Now, the question and the mission and the mandate that we have is to have the courage to scale them, to have the courage to formalize them and define for ourselves what formalizing actually even means, to capitalize them and to recognize them as legitimate engines of ownership creation. There is power in numbers, there is power in collaboration, and there's power in organizing. And I'm hoping that's what this 2 days actually is able to deliver. Collaboration, organizing, what we can do collectively And finally, representation does matter. It matters in institutional decision-making. It matters. Legislative power does matter. Political power does matter, because systems don't redesign themselves. Policy matters, regulation matters, institutional incentives matters, and that means women must not only be present in economies, we have to be present where economic rules are being written. We have to be in the legislatures, we have to be in investment committees, in central banks and boards, in regulatory institutions, in capital allocation structures, and of course, in the spaces where we are rebuilding and building these parallel systems and scaling these parallel systems. Ultimately, I say this all the time. I never speak without saying this. Nobody's coming to save us. Nobody's coming to save us but us, with our individual influence and with our collective power. And so if we're saying here today, we're starting to make a difference, we're starting to change things, we're starting to have power, we're starting to have control, we're starting to build parallel systems, we each have to commit to it. And I'm starting with my own commitment as a legislator, as a political leader, as a woman, that mine won't only be to speak inclusion, that it's going to be to push towards ownership, that it's going to be to push toward redesign, that it's going to be pushing towards structural transformation. Because we're not going to change the future by inviting more women into old rooms alone. We're going to change the future by having the courage to design a new house. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MP. I know you're rushing, but I think we want to do a quick group photo before you go, please. If you guys can join us quickly, she is rushing. She has to be in Parliament by 2 p.m. So please come along. Let's have a group photo with our distinguished guest. All of you, come. We'll do a quick group photo with our distinguished guest. I think it's an honor for us to do this. So we have to make it quick as she has to rush off for her flight. But thank you so much. We are honored. It's the power to? Power is not, hold on. Power is not given, it is? One. Power is not given, it is? One. Power is not given, it is one. Woo! Are you okay? Support team, you can come too if you want, please. Run. I know we squeezed together, but there's our that's the camera we're looking at. All the others, we appreciate you. Our main camera is straight ahead. So in 3, 2, 1, it's #HerEconomy2026. You need to look at the camera. If the camera doesn't see you, if you don't see the camera doesn't see you. Main camera in the middle. Okay, let's go.
3, 2, 1.
Her Economy 2026.
Let's do that again. Last one.
Her Economy 2026.
Thank you so much, MP Nobuntu. We appreciate you.